What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? Today, I got called out by GMan.
A Godless engineer, if we can't use the four Gospels to talk about Jesus, then what do you use when you talk about the life of Jesus? I'm just curious.
So yes, GMan and she who shall not be named name dropped me in a live stream the other day, and I wanted to take a moment to respond to them. So, if you want to know more, then please stay tuned. So before we begin our video today, I just wanted to take a second and let you know that normally on Tuesdays we do a daily Bible podcast. That's where KC and I go through the Bible in chronological order so that we can know what the actual Bible says about Christian theology. So if you want to learn more about the Bible and what it actually says and how horrible and illogical and non-historical it actually is, then I hope that you will tune in on Tuesdays at 9:15 a.m. Central. Now, normally the Bible podcasts are not really monetized by YouTube because it is the Bible and the Bible's horrible. So that's why we have the Skeptic Mafia. And I have yet to do the Skeptic Mafia call outs from last month. So that's what we're going to do right now because they are the ones that make the Daily Bible podcast possible. So, first to start off with the Globeheads, we have Ulterior Motifs, Chris Cowhig, the Clyde 950, Ardoin, Cadence, Stellar Monstrosity, and Sean J. You guys are awesome Globeheads, and I'm so glad that you're helping us put on the Daily Bible podcast as well as the Skeptic Mafia podcast. Another group of people that definitely deserves this shout out is the Pure Free Thinker group. That would be Transient Skeptic, Big Sky Pioneer 2, Jonathan Hanachek, Drew's Book Reviews, Mike L., and Hoosier Buddy. Thank you guys as well for making all of this possible. Alright, now with the call outs for the Skeptic Mafia out of the way, let's get into the video.
That's another thing that I just wanted to add is I just saw a video. I'm trying to remember who what's his name? Converse Contender just did a video on Godless Engineer. And one of the things that Godless Engineer does is he says, oh, we're not allowed to, if we want to talk about Jesus' resurrection, we're not allowed to go to the Gospels. And it's like, why? Why can't we go to the Gospels? These are four different authors. Even if you said that the synoptics are connected, the first three Gospels and the fourth one by John is different, you still at least have two different people putting in their opinions. And so to try to rule that out is really unfair, especially when a person like Godless Engineer doesn't even give people reasons for why he would rule those out.
So what she who shall not be named is referencing here is the Praise I Am That I Am and Converse Contender's review of one of my videos. Now, I don't think that she who shall not be named is purposefully misrepresenting the context of that video because she watched Praise I Am That I Am's video, which itself took me out of context. So the context of that video is that the 1 minute apologist was asking somebody, what kind of evidence would you give someone that doesn't accept the Bible or the New Testament as authoritative? So these would have to be things that are outside of the New Testament that verify that Jesus died, was resurrected, and appeared to people afterwards, right? So in my video, what I did was I actually gave them a little bit more than what they were restricting themselves to. They restricted themselves from using the New Testament altogether. And what I did was I gave them Paul. But I said that you still can't use the Gospels in this particular situation, but I am giving you Paul. So I don't fault she who shall not be named, but I do fault the inability to actually critically look at my position in that video and what I actually said. But basically in this particular section, she who shall not be named is actually mad at the Christians who were restricting themselves, just like Praise I Am That I Am was. Now, she also says that I don't give reasons as to why I don't accept the Gospels to be authoritative or that you can't use the Gospels to ground Jesus in history. Even though she says that I say that you can't use them to talk about Jesus, which is not what I said. I just said that you can't only use the Gospels to ground Jesus in history or to know any kind of facts about a historical Jesus. But what I'll do is I'll have the video where I respond to Praise I Am That I Am and Converse Contender. I'll have that linked in the description as well as up here in the cards or wherever. You'll be able to find it if you want to go and find out why exactly I don't trust the Gospels to be legitimate history.
Wait a minute. Godless Engineer actually told somebody that they can't go to the four Gospels?
Yeah, he said if we want to talk about Jesus, we can't go to the four gospels. It's like, well, those are the four gospels that give us the information about his ministry.
I like how she who shall not be named low-key admits that there's literally almost no evidence for the things that Jesus supposedly did on earth, other than these gospels that were written 40 plus years later that use other sources in order to fill their gospels with information. They also use the scriptures in order to inform themselves about what Jesus supposedly did. Not to mention the fact that the Gospels use Paul. That starts with Mark. Mark uses Paul to inform his theology, and then Matthew and Luke copy off of Mark, and then John, he also copies off of Paul by the time that John was written, which was very late in the first century or the early second century. He would have just been using the common Christian theology at the time in order to inform his gospel. So literally the best that you could do is maybe Mark, even though he uses Paul as a source. And we could tell that by the theology that Mark puts forth. It heavily matches what Paul's theology is.
Okay. Godless Engineer, if you're watching this, and by the way, if there's anybody who is subscribed to Godless Engineer or directly influenced him, he had a conversation with me. He knows my style of debating. Godless Engineer, if we can't use the four gospels to talk about Jesus, then what do you use when you talk about the life of Jesus? I'm just curious.
Okay, good question, GMan. Well, I definitely don't use the Gospels in order to talk about what Jesus actually did in life. I do use the Gospels to talk about Jesus, like of Christian theology, not of history. So what I use to talk about Jesus, like the historical version of Jesus, is Paul's writings, which is included in the New Testament. So no, I don't think that you can use the Gospels for any kind of historical proof, at least not just the Gospels themselves. You would also have to have some kind of contemporary evidence that was written around the time of Paul to suggest that the Gospels were writing legitimate history instead of like just whatever in the hell they wanted. You see, here's the curious thing about the Gospels. They don't actually cite any earthly source. All they do cite is the scriptures. And that's not how any history is done in the ancient world. They always cite who their source is. But yet, what do we find in the Gospels? We do not find any kind of author that is named in the Gospels. Not any of them name an author. We also don't find any sources attributed in the Gospels. All we find is the scriptures. Because of this reason alone, you can't exactly trust the Gospels to give you legitimate history. Plus, there's a lot of historical evidence that suggests that the Gospels are bullshit.
Like what does when he says that Jesus never existed, the resurrection never happened.
That's what he says. He's a mythicist.
Yeah. It's like if I can't use the four gospels, then you can't either.
Okay, fine. I won't use the Gospels. I already don't use the Gospels, but okay.
So it proves to me that Jesus never existed. Because if we're going to go to these secular sources, I got you with Josephus, Tacitus, and a whole bunch of other secular sources. I got you beaten with a bunch of different things. You know what I mean?
You're right. Yeah, you're right. And that's the thing. We have 9 secular sources within 150 years of Jesus' crucifixion that point to the New Testament and offer us validity for it.
Exactly.
But what you do is you take a critical look at those sources. And like Josephus, there's a lot of debates around the Testimonium Flavianum. And in that particular debate, it's pretty well established that it was entirely inserted. I mean, this has been covered multiple times in the scholarship. Right now, the best that you could say is that a later scribe altered what was already there. But even analyzing that, we can only go back to Eusebius's copy. Given that we don't have any kind of earlier copy that would have suggested that it was just an embellished form of a previous testimonium that was there, you can't say that less embellished version of the Testimonium Flavianum is the original thing that was there. Now, there's plenty of scholarship out there that shows conclusively that the Testimonium Flavianum was inserted, but the James passage is a little bit more ambiguous. Me personally, I side with the scholars that suggest that it was entirely interpolated and that it was originally talking about a Jesus ben Damnius and not the Jesus called the Christ. There's a lot of inconsistency inconsistencies there. I've covered it many times here on this channel. If you want to know more, all relevant links are going to be down below, or you could just download my Crestus app, where I extensively go through all of the arguments and all of the evidence for and against a historical Jesus. Now, he also brings up Tacitus. Even Robert Van Voorst, he says that Tacitus can't solidly place Jesus in history. All that it can really do is say that there were Christians in Rome during the burning of Rome, and that was in 64 AD, which I have no problem saying that there were Christians in Rome in 64 AD. Now, they go on to mention that there's several other sources that they could use, but all of them are so much later in the timeline that they are influenced by Christian theology, the already existing Christian theology, because all of them are written in the 2nd century where Christianity was already established. So you can't use those sources that are influenced by Christian theology in order to establish the historicity of Christian theology. They're poisoned. So the best evidence that you have is Paul. Paul was the first person to write about Jesus, to relay that he was crucified, that he died, and that he resurrected. But even then, all of the things in Paul that would have showed that he existed here on earth are quite ambiguous. Where Paul could have made it a lot less ambiguous, he surprisingly did not. With Paul being your best source for a historical Jesus and for the idea that Jesus died and resurrected, it doesn't really seem like your conclusion that he actually did die and resurrect and even exist doesn't have a lot of evidence to begin with. I do appreciate GMan directly asking me what my position is instead of just assuming that SJ was right and going on some kind of shit-talking tirade about me. So I do have to give him credit about that, but I would also urge him to look at the actual things that I said in the video that praise that I am reviewed, and carefully consider what I was talking about there, because it just seems like these are two Christians that are mad about what other Christians restricted the evidence to. So maybe you should just rethink that shit or something. I don't know. Please let me know down in the comments what you think about what GMan and She Who Shall Not Be Named said about my position, how it compares to the position that I relayed here. Let me know down in the comments. While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, and I will see you heathens later.